Hi, and welcome to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly program about finance, money, and investing on Radio Northern Beaches and broadcast nationally on the Community Radio Network around Australia. I'm your host, Ray Treverson from OTG Capital, and today we're welcoming to the microphone Frank Drenth, who is a subject matter expert and member of the tax technical team and writer at the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia. Now, ladies and gents, we've had many people in from IFPA and Tax and Super, as they were formerly known as before, but this is the first time for Frank. So, Frank, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Ray.
We're going to be covering off a subject today that I have to say, until I did some reading on it, I wasn't really familiar with it. So we're going to be talking about, I guess, how the ATO has finalised some judgments and rulings around Section 100A guidance. Now, to somebody that's out there and a bit of a novice to finance and money, they're going to sit there and scratch their heads. So maybe if we started off, can you give the listeners a bit of an explanation of what Section 100A in the tax code is all about?
Section 100A, Ray, is a specific anti-avoidance measure that was introduced in the late 1970s by none other than the former Treasurer and Prime Minister John Howard. And it was aimed at what was called trust stripping arrangements, which were aggressive plans that people implemented that were designed to pull money out of trusts, which had big tax liabilities, potentially big tax liabilities, and by introducing low tax and non-tax beneficiaries who would keep maybe 5 or 10% of the distribution and then lend it back or give it back to the people controlling the trusts. It was a lurk, and soon after the announcement came out and the law was legislated back in 1979, these schemes pretty well disappeared, and people stopped thinking about Section 100A until quite recently, when the tax office gave it a new lease of life.
And what's the background to the ATO giving this a new lease of life? I mean, there'll be many listeners out there scratching their head thinking that John Howard, certainly in the time when he was Prime Minister, was a bastion for certainly a certain amount of middle class largesse, one would argue, through the tax code, through some of the very generous franking credits that were made available during that time, and a lot of deregulation in spaces that certainly many businesses benefited from. But to listen to that preamble about John Howard in 1979, why all of a sudden is it now news again?
Well, the tax office is having a closer look at high wealth families and individuals, and it's got what it's called the Next 5,000 program. That's looking mostly at privately held businesses and wealth, and they're looking to deploy what was this specific measure introduced in the heady days of bottom of the harbour schemes against family trusts doing things they've been doing for decades, if not generations. And nobody had seriously thought until early last year that there was anything wrong in the eyes of the commissioner or anybody else with making a distribution to young adult children who are still at uni and not earning much money.
So is this something that's come in with the new treasurer and change of government from May of last year, or is this something that was already being instigated by the previous government?
No, it's been brewing for some time, and I can't say it's been instigated by any government. It's the tax office operates independently, as we know, and they've just seized on this specific measure that was introduced for a very narrow range of circumstances and applied it much more broadly than anybody thought was possible or likely. So now the problem is where this section applies, and it's quite mechanical the way that it's drafted, where it applies, and there is what they call a reimbursement agreement around the distribution, then the beneficiary is deemed never to have been entitled to the distribution, and the trustee gets assessed at top rates.
I guess one of the aspects it's a curiosity to me, Frank. You may not know, I actually studied public management in my master's degree, and so having studied public policy and legislation back in my MBA days. It's one of those, I guess, funny jokes that people say there are two things you don't want to see made, and that's sausages and laws. And so, is this recent advent of ATO activity around the 100-day guidance now a factor of an unintended consequence of the law, or is this simply now a more aggressive and a more assertive tax office seeking to claw back, I guess, tax benefits that shouldn't necessarily be going out there?
Well, the tax office has a cute way of saying that where you look at an outcome which you think which you're pretty sure was unintended. They'll say, no, that was always the intention. It's meant to operate this way. And
That's
treasuries are
like
much the
cute,
same.
cute. I've never heard cute use the word in the same sentence as
Yeah.
the ATO, but please proceed.
Um, so the reasoning, if as far as it represents reasoning, is that this was always intended to apply to distributions among family businesses, which we um, which is news to most practitioners, and uh, most practitioners and their clients would think there was nothing wrong with making a distribution to a 21-year-old university student who doesn't have much other income. The problem is that the tax office is saying, and again, they're being cute in a way, yep, you can make this distribution to your 21-year-old son who doesn't get out of bed until midday and lounges around most of the rest of the time, but you have to actually give him the money. Now, a lot of people running family business love their young adult children, but they're not too keen on giving them 100 grand to spend as they wish.
Oh, so in other
And
words,
that's,
they're not
and that's,
getting the
and that's
money
what the
then.
tax
This is the issue.
This is the issue. And the way that family trusts, not all of them, but a lot of them have been run over the years, is the young adult gets given a distribution, but it remains in the trust as working capital, as an unpaid present entitlement. And this is the part that the tax office is attacking. And I suspect they're having some fun sitting back and seeing what people decide to do about actually giving their young adult children the 100,000, the 50,000, the 200,000, whatever it is, because they want to optimize their tax. That's what has to happen. And that's not the end of it. Once they give the money to the young adult beneficiary, the tax office is going to come back and make sure that the young adult beneficiary didn't give it back to mum and dad. So practitioners
Oh,
are now going to have to be able to prove to the tax office what happened to the distribution after the beneficiary got it. So there's more compliance work that someone will have to stump up for.
so I guess when we say this out loud, Frank, and believe me, I read the daily missives that come in from Accountants Daily, from IFMA's newsletters, from SMSF trustees, and I see lots and lots of noise, I guess, in the financial markets, notwithstanding what's happening in the markets themselves. But this 100A ruling really has attracted a lot of column inches, dare I use that old parlance, but it has attracted a lot of column inches, but it sounds like it's not impacting a huge amount of people. Are we talking about the same kind of slither of society that was impacted recently by the latest changes in superannuation and the $3 million cap, for example? Are we talking about that size, or is this something that is generally used quite widely, let's say in rural and regional communities as well, where family trusts, I think, with farms and the like, would be far more common, one would think?
Yeah, farms would use trust structures. It's very common, and it's for intergenerational reasons as well. But um, this interpretation affects a lot more than the 0.5% that the superannuation cap is supposed to impact, at least initially, um, and it affects any family business operating through a trust, which has beneficiaries who are low tax. And these are not always adult children. They can be grandparents who've got most of the money in super and don't have a big tax liability in their own account. So people have been optimizing their tax, but not actually handing over the money.
And I guess it begs the question then, because when this kind of thing is happening, are the people that are the beneficiaries but don't necessarily get the money, are they always aware that that's occurring, or is it something that they find out after the fact?
Well, you hear stories about, excuse me, about beneficiaries who didn't have much of an idea and who pretty well signed whatever mum and dad put in front of them, and they'll go along to the accountant once a year and just sign things. Um, but there are others who've got an unpaid present entitlement of several $100,000 who will go up to mum and dad and say, "Well, you owe me some money," and you know,
Cough up.
I'd like to go. I'd like to go on that big overseas trip. I'd like to buy that flash car I've always wanted. I wouldn't mind making a deposit on a home, so hand it over, and legally, mum and dad would have to.
Wow, that would be a conversation that would be, I'd love to be a fly on the wall for, I must admit. And I guess being, in your position as the subject matter expert on this matter at IFPA, at the Institute, are you finding that there's been a lot more inquiries coming into your hotline about this specific kind of situation?
Yeah, we had a big brush of questions in May, June last year, coming up to the June 22 distributions, and people not sure what to do. There was a major concern about retrospectivity, uh, which with the tax office initially saying that this interpretation applies both before and after the ruling was issued, but they've walked back from that a little bit, and they're now saying if you've relied on some previous guidance, then we won't worry about pre-2022 distributions. So it's the ones that are coming up in June 2023, um, just over 3 months away, that's going to be occupying people's attention.
Okay, well, look, we're just about time for a break here on dollars and making sense. When we come back from the break, Frank, I want to talk a little bit about the challenge and the Guardian case, and talk a little bit more and flesh out some examples that you've provided me in some of the background reading notes. I think are really interesting, and we should drill down a little bit. So we'll go to a short break. You're here on Dollars and Making Sense. I'm Ray Treverson, and at the microphone we have Frank Drenth, subject matter expert from the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia. We'll be back in just a moment. Hi, and thank you for listening to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly radio program about finance, money, and investing on Radio Northern Beaches and nationally on the Community Radio Network around Australia. The views, comments, and opinions aired during our program should not be construed or viewed as financial advice. Any commentary is general advice only and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. You should consider whether the advice is suitable for you and your personal circumstances. If in doubt, you should contact an authorised licensed financial planner. We welcome questions and feedback, and you can get in touch with us via our blog, social media channels, or email. Please search for Dollars and Making Sense in your favourite podcast platform, or check out our blog at otgcapital.com.au/blog. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm Ray Treverson, and at the microphone today we have Frank Drenth, a subject matter expert and technical writer, part of the tax team at the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia. And today, believe it or not, we're talking 100A guidance. Now, please don't fall asleep, ladies and gentlemen. This is really important stuff, because it turns out a lot more people are actually impacted by this ruling that they might think. And I guess in the break, Frank, we were talking about that. It can impact a lot of people without them even really knowing about it. Is that true?
Well, that's right. At the business level, at the client level, there's probably not that much awareness, and it really depends on whether the tax advisors are going out and engaging their clients, because things will have to be different going forward. Keeping beneficiaries in the dark about their distribution just isn't on anymore, and um, uh, both the people controlling the trust and the beneficiaries need to be aware of what's going on. Um, One of the, I suppose you could call it concessional measures in the fund life guidance is that the tax office isn't going to worry about an undistributed amount until it's 2 years old. So that opens up possibly some scope for things to be different. So you could go to a beneficiary and say, well, we're making a distribution to you for $100,000 this year, but you don't need to decide what to do with it for another 2 years. And when the time comes, it'll be your decision alone, and we'll just leave it at that. Because if you have a detailed discussion about the beneficiary eventually forgiving the debt or putting it back into the trust or giving it to mum and dad, then you're in danger of having what they call a reimbursement agreement. So at the time that you make the distribution, it was all planned. But if it's open-ended, you've got 2 years to decide. It's sitting in the trust. It's fine there for now. You're entitled to it, but you don't have to call for it for up to 2 years. Then that opens up the possibility that there isn't a reimbursement agreement and 100A doesn't apply. But you shouldn't overthink it.
So when you say a reimbursement agreement, that in effect says you've got to give the money back.
The reimbursement agreement is a technical term used in the legislation, and it just means that a beneficiary receives a distribution, but there is an agreement, an agreement is very broadly defined, that someone else will benefit from their distribution. So if what happened was, if mum and dad said to their student son, we'll give you a $100,000 distribution if you buy mum a new car at Christmas time. And, everybody loves their mum, and that sounds like an ordinary family dealing to me. But then you've set it up right at the start and you've made it conditional and people understand what's going to happen. That's a reimbursement agreement.
Okay.
On the other hand, if you give them the money and say, we're holding the money for you, we're holding it for up to 2 years, you can call for it at any time, but you've got to let us know before the 2 years are up, then maybe you haven't got a reimbursement agreement. That's not clear. The other thing that isn't clear is what constitutes an ordinary family or business dealing, because ordinary family business dealings are not caught by 100A. And this is where the tax office plays hardball. There is a decision you referred to just before the break, Guardian, where the taxpayer succeeded on Section 100A, but fell over under the general anti-avoidance rules, which is another provision again. But because in the Guardian case, nothing had been set up beforehand about what was going to happen to the distribution, and the court held that there was no pre-existing reimbursement agreement, but also because there was nothing artificial about what happened in Guardian, it was covered by the ordinary family dealing exemption. Now, the tax office doesn't agree with that, even though it's clearly the law at the moment.
Right. Okay, so I guess from that perspective, there is some scope, though, in reading the notes that, let's say you are in a mum and dad situation and the loafing student, although I must say, if I describe that about my children, they might have something to say about that one, but I digress. But there is some ability for the mum and dad to claw back some costs, I guess, around living expenses and potentially university tuition fees as well.
Yeah. Under the ruling, where the money is used for the student beneficiaries' own well-being, then it's been applied for their own benefit, and it won't be caught by 100A. So if there was an amount from the trust used to cover university fees, that wouldn't be subject to Part 4A. To Section 100A. But also, getting a major distribution from a trust is no different from having a job, and a child like that should pay board. And looking at some websites about what is reasonable to charge foreign students, we reckon that's over $300 a week. So it's around the $18,000 mark. It's not huge money, but you get that 18,000 plus something for the for the university fees, and you might be up to 25, 30,000 that you can cover.
So
It
there's
generally
no
requires
there's no $500,000 board type of residences available for mum and dad's trust to write off then.
not unless the services are exceptionally good.
I often wonder, I'd be sitting there again, being a fly on the wall, watching an accountant ponder this with a mum and dad saying, but look, we live in a nice part of Sydney or Melbourne, and I'm sure, a normal standard commercial rent for this kind of property would be X and not sort of a tenth of X, and having that kind of discussion. Anyway, I digress. So look, going forward, one of the things that people are going to have to do, and one of the questions I'd written down here, I guess, again, for context perspective, can you, and again, it's a question without notice, but do you have a grip or a grasp, Frank, on how many family trusts actually are operating in the market today in Australia?
Oh, there's hundreds of thousands. Trusts, the use of trusts in Australia is, and people from the US and the UK and other places are constantly surprised when they discover how prevalent the use of trusts is in Australia. This is something that's grown over the years. It gives you a lot of flexibility. It gives you asset protection. You can optimize your tax within your family group, and it's just very popular, and it's been a very effective way to run your business.
Okay, and I
But
think it's important for the
there'll be
listeners to
tens of
understand there.
thousands.
So we're not talking about the hallowed few when we're, for example, talking about the upper echelons of superannuation caps, and again, the hyperbole in the media sometimes when the rabid running of, oh, there's somebody with almost $500 million in super. It's like, that's one. Okay, so let's get context, and I think understanding that there are hundreds of thousands of family trusts out there, not dissimilar, I guess, when you think about the SMSF environment. I think last count, I think we were close to 700,000 SMSFs out there. So when people talk about running your own super, I think the context says, hey, that's a lot of people out there doing it. And I guess, Frank, thank you for that context that says, hey, there are a lot of people out there operating family trusts for all those reasons you've just mentioned. And so I guess, what are the key things that people are going to have to do now as they look forward into tax planning season and beyond, given the outcomes of this federal case? They're still being reviewed and some further discussion, or are they fairly sure that this is the way they're going to go forward?
On the Guardian case, we found out a few days ago that neither side is applying for special leave to appeal to the High Court. So it's been left at the full federal court decision. So the taxpayer in Guardian doesn't want to go on any further, and the commissioner is happy with this Part 4A victory. So that's where we stand. But it tells us nothing about 100, or doesn't tell us very much about 100A, except that it didn't apply in the Guardian case due to the specific circumstances there. We were hoping it would tell us something more about the family and ordinary family commercial dealing exception, but because of what they found on there not being a reimbursement agreement, the court didn't have to decide that, so they left it alone. There's another case bubbling through called B Blood, where the commissioner was successful, but when that gets decided by the full federal court, we may get some more comments about the exemption, about the exceptions.
So, look, one of the things I like to do here on Dollars and Making Sense, Frank, I guess, is to leave some takeaways for our listeners. So, I guess what I've heard during the course of our discussions today, I mean, they've been a real education for me, I've got to say. Those of us that are out there operating family trusts, I think it's the normal thing, planning is really, really important. And I think from what you've said is being able to sit down with your tax planning agency, whatever that may be, a first tier or even your mum and dad accountant around the corner. I think flagging forward your intentions, I think, is pretty important then in this trust environment. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, it is. And when you get to the planning stage, what you decide to do will depend on your appetite for risk. Because it's all very
Ah,
well for me to sit back here and say, well, the ordinary family dealing exception is much wider than the Commissioner concedes, and you should feel quite relaxed about the young adult beneficiary lending their money back to the trust indefinitely. Um,
mm.
I think that is quite arguably an ordinary family dealing. Um, um, but as I say, it's all right for me to say that. Um, but for someone to actually do it, they're running the risk of having that distribution tax at the top marginal rate. Now,
Okay,
if you're
so
at the
to
top
wrap up.
marginal rate,
Mhm.
sorry.
No, no, no. Sorry, you were saying?
Well, if you're talking about very large amounts of trust income, and mum and dad who would otherwise get the distribution would be on the top marginal rate anyway, I guess there isn't much downside to risking the application of Part 4A.
Right. Well, so to wrap up, I guess resources. So where, obviously, if they've got an accountant, one would hope if they've set these up, they would have their normal account in place. But if you wanted to do reading, the IFPA, the ifpa.com.au is a great place to start. Would you suggest, Frank, to start doing some reading around the implications around the federal court and the 100A ruling?
Yeah, if you want to catch up on, if you still want to get a feel for it, they're reasonably easy reads. If you go onto the website and look for the Outlook magazine, and that's got a few articles in it. But really, if your tax advisor hasn't contacted you, contact them and make sure you address it before you get too far into June, so that you know where you're heading.
Wonderful. Great advice. So look, Frank, thanks so kindly for being on the show today. It's certainly been an education for me. It's a big world out there, and I had a thought that there were a lot of family trusts out there, and obviously there are. So look, thank you for listening to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly program about finance, money, and investing on Radio Northern Beaches and nationally on the Community Radio Network around Australia. We welcome questions and feedback, and you can get in touch with us via our blog, social media channels, or email. Frank, thanks so kindly for being on the show today. We'll welcome you back in the future, I hope. And until next time, Frank, thanks for being here with us.
Thanks for having me, Ray. All the best.
And to you too. Adios.